blamed him. I had it coming to me. Run out on me because you couldn't take it, because you knew what it would be like?
Good morning, Papists. Ave Maria. Brian with City of the Immaculata, back with you, finally. I keep having to take some extended breaks due to extenuating circumstances. Let me bring up the comments so I have those ready. Grab my notes here. So, Flammarion's engraving, I present to you. As well, you guys remember this from last time, the Logos, Christ, the Son, the Word ordering the cosmos, giving order to the universe. I bring it back. Why do I have these? The impetus for this particular talk was actually given to me through the question that my son posed to me recently. There is a, let me think, what is it? Out of the mouth of babes, right? Isn't that how the King James Version says it? There is this tendency for children to ask very challenging questions. And the question that he asked to me at the dinner table, this was a few weeks ago, he said, "Dad, why do you believe that Jesus is God?" Basically, why do I believe in Jesus? And I have a very precocious 9-year-old, and I didn't want to just throw out some answer. I said I wanted to give some sustenance to the answer that I provided, because he's very smart and he will challenge me if he thinks that I am kind of deflecting on his questions. As well, when your child comes to you with legitimate religious questions, you need to take it with some sincerity, because certainly a baptized child is got some of the guidance and the protection there of the Holy Spirit. And so the area that I live in, interestingly enough, is one of the most famous areas in the country for the nighttime sky. And the skies that we have when we go out at night here are unlike any I have ever experienced. We still have to get up to the mountains at night to be able to see it from the one of the overlooks, the views. But even just here in our town, the nighttime sky is absolutely gorgeous. And he and I had a conversation one time about the ordering of the night sky and how ancient people saw that order as something that pointed towards the order of the intention behind the order. And so the answer that I gave him is going to be directly related to the conversation that I have with you guys here today. Okay, so let's get a rundown of what is really happening here. Now, you guys know that I have a great love for the medieval scholastic period and what they were attempting to do, the theologians of that time and the philosophers, both in method and in content. But I think there's a flaw in some of the ways that we attempt to bring or force certain aspects of their content into a post-scientific revolutionary world. And where I do believe there's value and ultimately truth found in, say, the 5 arguments for God contained in St. Thomas's Summa, I don't believe that they are really relevant to bring forth in trying to own atheists in debate. Because in the end, atheists, unless they're generally unschooled, will just kind of knock these arguments down as presupposing too much about the nature of motion, for example. So if we want to be effectively using these arguments, though I think the term argument is a bit misleading at times, if we want to be using these arguments outside a Catholic context, it's important to have a wide swath of tools to draw from. Now, again, before any of you misunderstand me, I'm not saying that I don't believe in the arguments from motion or cause, because I do. I'm just saying that there is a limit to their value outside of a very specific worldview, a worldview which I grant as true and one that I personally believe. But you kind of have to set that worldview up before you get to that point where you can make those arguments. And I also think it's fine and valid and probably even more fruitful in many ways to have these conversations within a strictly Catholic context. There's much to be gained by doing that, but I actually tend towards that in my own personal life as a sort of different approach to the dialectical method. And granted, my approach may not be useful in evangelizing atheists. I don't think that's necessarily the most important thing. But I do begin with the premise when I approach anyone out in the world, and any non-Catholic, non-Christian, that this is a person whose heart is restless. And the less religious that this person is, the more restless their heart. So, drawing inspiration from Bonaventure, I begin with the premise that God cannot be denied at an intuitive level because he is, in fact, self-evident. He is present in a way which we're going to explain here in just a little bit. Now, I want to preface this by giving a little plug here. I was looking for the book before I started this live, and I couldn't find it. You know, we scaled down, and just as an aside here, like we live in a much smaller apartment, and I seem to have a harder time keeping up with my books in this small apartment than I did in my previous home. This is like a temporary apartment for us, and for whatever reason, because I don't have my nice I don't have my office anymore for the foreseeable future until we move over to this other place we're going to be at. I'm kind of stuck leaving books around. Anyways, I wanted to present to you guys my copy of Bonaventure's De Mysterio Trinitatis on the disputed questions on the mystery of Christ, because I want you guys reading Bonaventure. I really do. I wanted to make a plug for him, but I don't have the book to show you guys. But regardless, you should be reading Bonaventure. You should familiarize yourself with these things, because I'm not like, in a sense, there's a little bit of my like hodgepodging some of these things together, but none of these are original to me. Much greater, much more holier men and women have come before me who have made these things presentable to us. So, per Bonaventure, he says that God has imprinted his existence on the human soul, and no matter where you go, as a human, you cannot escape yourself. It's the one thing you can escape, try as you may. Now, is that an argument in the modern sense of the word? No, but it is a worldview. It's how I begin. It's how I begin when I approach a person out on the streets that I know is not a Christian, that I know is not a Catholic, whether they are cognizant of not, and there's a good chance they're not cognizant of it. This person, God is self-evident to this person. Now, the key element to this is this concept of intelligibility. The reason I think this argument, as it were, is useful is because when we encounter the world, we do not encounter a vacuous void that sucks our sense perception in like a black hole without returning back anything to us. Excuse me, something just hit my eye. No, in fact, the senses are inundated with copious data that they have to funnel to the best of their ability into the mind. This image that I encounter, right? The data of it funnels through my senses. My mind abstracts information about it, the weight, the proportionality, the number, so on. And so how is this even happening? Not on a mechanical level, right? We can, as we're going to discuss here, we can answer a lot of these things on a mechanical level. On a metaphysical level, how is this happening? And the reason is wholly and completely Trinitarian, especially the idea of the Logos. As I just said, science can answer a lot about the mechanics of how things come to be and the process of how the thing functions. Cognition as a function of various synapses firing correctly, transmitting information, that's important. We don't separate faith from reason. Reason can ascertain certain things about this, but the capacity for a thing does not explain the phenomena of the thing. Let me say that again and let that sink in. The capacity for a thing does not explain the phenomena of the thing. The fact that the world pulsates, that it emanates this sense data, and the fact that our senses can reach out and grasp it. Think of those words, the words that we use around this, right? Grasp, to apprehend. This imagery of having the thing itself in your possession. The senses grasp the data, and then and the most amazing thing about all of this, they present the data to the mind. The mind processes it in this first-person subjective experience. It's, pardon the idiom, it's mind-blowing when you think about this. Presents it to the mind, and then the mind itself grasps it, creating what the scholastics would have called a phantasm. Now, again, science can say a lot of things about the mind, even where memory is stored, how I'm capable of, how I have the capacity to taste an apple, for example. I just finished a 5-day fast. Yesterday, I finished the fast by eating an apple. And let me tell you, folks, after 5 days of fasting, this apple was extraordinary. Science can say a lot of things about why the taste buds are able to pull from the apple taste, the sensation of taste. Science can answer that. What it cannot answer is this magical thing where I can recall eating apples as a grandfather with my child. I can recall eating apples as a child with my grandfather, as this unique subjective experience that belongs only to me, as well the experience of what it's like to call to mind that recollection as I'm eating the apple for the first time after 5 days of not eating. This is the well-known problem of consciousness, which is a separate, related, and interesting conversation. But so drawing directly from Augustine, Bonaventure says that the mind is capable of grasping truths because there is this illumination that takes place. I've talked about this before in other lectures, and I go into it in great detail, but this is something that's easily misconstrued, as some thinkers have done through the centuries. What this is not, per Bonaventure, per Augustine, divine illumination is not a theory that God is enlightening the mind, giving it its data. It's not a subtle fideism. Rather, it's an innate, how do I want to say this? It's an innate act where God is like the light illuminating the room that makes you able to see your way around the room. Bonaventure says in his Mind's Journey to God that just as light allows us to perceive a room, what's in the room, the contents of the room, without perceiving necessarily the light itself. Hopefully that image makes sense there. The light permeates the room, it emanates, it allows us therefore to see the contents of the room. Just as that happens and the function of light in a room, so too does our ability to perceive beings, individual beings, without perceiving being itself at the simultaneous moment that that process is taking place. Really try to pull that imagery into your mind. The mind is illuminated. It's a God's illuminating light shines in the mind, and it's because of this that the mind is able to therefore receive the sensible species out there in the world. And again, remember, an important attribute of all of this is that the world out there that the mind is receiving, the data that's coming back into the mind, isn't this massive void of chaos. There's order. What does the mind find when it goes out there? It finds order, it finds hierarchy, it finds rationality. This is not a given, folks. The fact that the world is like this. Many scientists will just grant that to themselves. I'm picking on scientists here. Many secular atheists, these types will grant themselves this. Einstein didn't grant that. Albert Einstein, famous 20th century physicist, no Catholic. He was nominally Jewish and struggled with the question of God, but he ultimately came to be a believer himself. Not a Christian, not a Catholic believer, but a believer that there was something in an explanatory sense that we should be able to call God, because Einstein said that the most unexplainable thing about the universe is that we can't explain it. We take it for granted because of the mind, the illumined mind that is acting as if the light being on in the room is a given. So we have this sense. The senses touch and receive the world, and the world, and at that point is then presented to the mind. Just going through some of the comments here real quick. Okay. So the order and the rationality of the cosmos reflects back to the mind, the divine mind, that makes accessible to us the divine mind itself. And our ability to understand the divine mind it stems from our participation in the Logos, who, specifically speaking, after the incarnation, is Christ. You can imagine me trying to explain this to my 9-year-old, put it in 9-year-old terms, but this again goes back to Christ, the Logos, ordering the cosmos, this icon that's so beloved to me. I had a conversation not long ago with a friend, and we were discussing like what an amazing thing it is that there are these. We were having a conversation about medicinal herbs, and the idea that in our very woods, in our very backyards, we can go and pick these plants. And hey, look, if you're an evolutionist, if you're a secularist, if you're this type, I mean, if you're actually an evolutionist, this is more astounding for you guys, because here you have this plant, this herb that you can pull out of the ground and bring into your home and use it for a child's headache or some rash or whatever it may be. It's as if this thing, if you take the evolutionist perspective and their worldview, it's as if this thing emerges from the dirt of the earth, and after millions of years, it's just conveniently there waiting for you to pluck it up. And that you, the human, is able to go and sense that there is something about this plant that in its, we extract. One of the things that scientists like to do now is they like to extract certain compounds from herbs. This is how you get aspirin, acetaminophen. It was originally extracted from the willow bark. Just assuming, right, that after millions of years that this thing would be ordered there, neatly placed for you. Or another way to look at it, if you take something like Beethoven's Fifth, probably a perfectly written piece of music. Listening, I think it's, if I remember right, I think it's in C major. And I'm positive that there is some kind of like mathematical symmetry with the notes that probably all added up would give you, I mean, because if you think about it, right, like notes are just a certain amount of vibrations per second, and harmony is the like alignment of certain waves and frequencies that match. So the fifth, this harmonic masterpiece, for the evolutionist, it was just, what was it? It was like this potential thing that just existed in the ether world forever, since the dawn of time, since the Big Bang, waiting for little old Beethoven to come along, and like me picking an herb up, plucking it out of the field for him to just sort of find it there at his piano. That's an incredible thing to consider. We would say, though, as Christians, especially if you're coming from this Bonaventurian notion of things, that the reason that Beethoven's Fifth was there, waiting for Beethoven to be written, the reason that that herb is there, and I can extract information about the health benefits of that herb, is because we have access via divine illumination to the divine ideas, which exist eternally. Chesterton says that we imagine the universe as this thing so mind-bogglingly large as to really kind of threaten to overwhelm our senses. Think about the size and the scope and the massiveness of the universe, and it really, like, Carl Sagan has the billions and billions of stars, right? When in reality, as Chesterton points out, the universe is like, it's so tiny as to be this like treasured jewel that we should just kind of carefully hold in our hands so not to damage it. The entire world that we inhabit is like, it's like a garden, which, yes, has very significant imagery back to Genesis. And all over we find these like precious gems along the way, like these residual markings left behind by an artist, as if breadcrumbs to sort of compel us, to keep us searching, to go a little bit further. You know, I watch these YouTube videos. You guys would probably be surprised by some of the YouTube videos that I watch. I don't watch much by way of Catholic content. There's a few people that I like and I'll watch occasionally, but for leisure, you know, for to get my theology, I tend to like to read it. But for leisure, I like watching sort of different kind of things. Like, what would be an example? I can't think of anything off the top of my head specifically to what I'm just going to reference here. But one of the things I like to watch is there's a channel with an archaeologist, and it's just super fascinating stuff. I just like watching it, and so I follow this archaeologist. He's a fine enough fella, but he's clearly an atheist, I would say, at least from what I could gather from watching some of his content. And he said in passing on one of his videos recently, and it's like just stuck with me based on as I was putting together some of my notes for this, that he said in passing that we're all just monkeys on a giant rock hurtling through a vacuum. Now, he was being tongue-in-cheek when he said this, but I've heard this from atheists before, and it's actually completely backwards. Anybody that goes out and seriously looks at what's taking place out there, maybe the most learned fail to recognize this, but the simplest of children recognize it. Children see it in a way, in a sense, that's like beyond. I think children have more than the later abstractive process that we as adults go through. Children's have a much more intuitive way of reading it. And I mean intuitive in the classical scholastic sense of intuition, before the process of abstraction. They kind of, in many ways, see the world as it is. We're not just monkeys hurtling on a rock. In fact, we're very bizarrely at home here in some ways. And I don't just grant that that is because it is. It's as if everything points, as if everything is like screaming to keep looking. There's this innate sense to go further, keep looking. As Augustine says, the restless heart. Every aspect of this, I think, must be considered. Again, even the fact that I am able to identify let's say I'm going through the woods and I'm tracking someone. Someone's lost in the woods and they've been breaking twigs and leaving signs along the way that makes it possible to track them, to discover them. Just the fact that I possess this ability to venture into the world, to experience it, that the world is giving me this data, these trail markers that are leading me in a direction. This is why Bonaventure says that God's existence is self-evident, because it is the precondition for truth, for being and for intelligibility in the first place. There is in this, as is probably evidence to many of you, a very transcendent aspect. Transcend etymologically derives from the words meaning to cross over, to go beyond. So there is a moving sense in the word of transcend. It's not just static. It's not necessarily even stable. It's a moving process to transcend. And this brings me to the Flammarion engraving. If I can kind of get it up there for you guys. I'm sure most of you have seen this at some point or another. It was commissioned by Camille Flammarion in a work that he published discussing a medieval pilgrim who breaks beyond the horizontal limitations of the cosmos that we are discussing here. This pilgrim lifts the veil, so to speak. And I've always kind of loved this image. I'm sure many of you have seen, there's the black and white version of it that is actually used in the thumbnail. And then there's this colored image, which of course comes from the 70s. I kind of, it's kind of boomerish, but I kind of like the colored version a little bit more. But anyways, this pilgrim, if you see him here, he's in the bottom here, and he's gone beyond the limitations of the horizon, and he's sort of peeking under the horizon as if he's lifting a curtain and looking what's past the horizon. And essentially, I think that's what we're all trying to do. Christians, non-Christians, religious, non-religious, we're all trying to break the veil, as it were. Now, ultimately, as Catholics, we believe that, one, the veil has been torn asunder and God has been made present to us, revealed to us, I should say. God's always been present to us, but revealed to us in a sense that is unique in our when we're pairing faith and reason together. The faith aspect is that these things, in many senses, have been revealed to us as Catholics and as Christians, but even non-Christians are trying to break the veil. And ultimately, we will all be crossing over this veil at death. We as Catholics, I guess the other thing to point out too is that as we sojourn through this life, in many ways we experiences cases where that veil becomes very, very thin, especially at every Mass. But it's what each human life is searching for, whether they know it or not. Like, what is actually just beyond the horizon? And I was trying to explain this, like my wife and I were talking about this image. She really wasn't familiar with the Flammarion engraving, but I was saying, it's not just like, obviously we know that if you were to go into the horizon and if you were to like go into space, for example, eventually you're just going to reach space. That's not what we're talking about with this imagery. We're talking about what's actually like beyond the limitations of what the human mind and the physical sense objects that we are experiencing can provide us. That's sort of what we're trying to get at with that. And I think it's really well depicted here because you have a man in this image. It's a simple pilgrim. If you read Flammarion's description of this, he's probably only ever tended to sheep. I'm sure he's illiterate. I'm sure he, has little care or concern for the worldly men of power. What they've done in their world probably has little value to him. History books will never record his name. And yet, even this pilgrim, you can imagine him tending to his sheep, looking at the horizon, questioning what's beyond the border there. And in this engraving here, he's able to lift the veil, to cross over inquisitively, because there is this world, even through the lens. I mean, you would assume a medieval pilgrim would be a Christian, but let's just assume it's a non-Christian, right? Even for them, the world is inviting them to lift the veil. Even the beyond here, like if you notice, the beyond for the Flammarion engraving seems to be something of a cloud of unknowing. It's a little bit ineffable. It's certainly structured and ordered, though Flammarion seems to be kind of giving it a sense of there's like a machinery working behind it all, but there's, again, with that, like we think of the sense of the cloud of unknowing. And I think maybe what this would be, if you were to interpret it through a strictly Christian lens, he's probably touched upon the angelic realm here, not necessarily the beatific vision, but even the angelic realm. Even if you were to lift the veil and experience the world through the lens of the angelic realm, even that points you to go further. I believe, drawing from the great spiritual masters, that all existence is a part of this journey to God. Whereas Bonaventure states, like on the Sabbath day, we will eventually come to rest. But before we get there, in the background, all around us, along the edges of the horizon, Bonaventure says the center and the circumference of all things, it's in there that we find order. It's that we find intelligibility. We find a rational, structured, hierarchical universe. A universe, one verse, one word, one logos. It's brilliant. It's so astonishingly simple. The logos comes through the unifying. It comes through as the unifying, the center and the circumference, the first and the last, the ever eternal and yet the ever completely present. This is why I think Chesterton is so right to say that maybe we shouldn't be so concerned with trying to convince the rationalist of God on his own terms. Yes, I think there is value and validity to the 5 ways of Aquinas, to the various arguments that the spiritual masters make in the scholastic period. I think there is value to that. But as Chesterton said, you don't enter the insane asylum and argue with a man in his padded cell. You at best invite him out of the room. You try to show him these ineffable little gems that are all around us out here. And this is why nature is so important for us. Why it is even acknowledged by science as having a healing power. The beauty of a songbird or the sound of wind moving through the leaves. We as Christians know that sound isn't accidental. That bird sung at that moment. Those leaves rustled right when you were there to hear them, because the entire universe has been waiting thousands, millions, billions of years just for you to come along at that exact perfect time to hear them sing of the glories of our Creator. And with that in mind, I invite you, dear listeners, to go spend some time in nature. I will be covering St. Francis of Assisi's Canticle of Creation here in one of the next series of lectures that I'll be doing. And I think there's something to be said about the way that I put it is this. Many people go to nature to find God. St. Francis found God and then found nature. That would be the ideal approach to do all of this, right? But very few of us are St. Francis. I, even as a lover of St. Francis, as a contemplative theologian, St. Francis soared like an eagle, where I'm sure I've probably read more books of theology than St. Francis ever did. Yet I crawl on the ground like a worm, while St. Francis soared in the air like an eagle. So in many respects, when I go out to nature looking for God. And God, in his graciousness and his divine and infinite, truly infinite wisdom, placed these little gems there just for me to find. We went yesterday to one of the most fantastic places on earth, not far from my house at all. Giant waves hitting the rocks, smashing against the rocks. And I'm way up in the air. These cliffs are pretty large. And I'm just finished this fast, and I've had a lot to reflect on. I've had a lot I've been thinking about, and I'm just kind of like watching these rocks, and I'm thinking, how far did that, like, there's two or three of the waves were pretty substantial. And when they hit these rocks, they crash. It's this loud crashing sound. And right next to them, there was this family of seagulls, and the seagulls were calling out. But I'm thinking, like, how far did that wave travel to crash right at that moment? And this really, it goes to exactly what I'm talking about. Like, when the Logos ordered the universe, God knows all things eternally now. He knew that at that moment I would be sitting there. That wave could have traveled for hundreds and hundreds of miles to crash at that precise second that I was sitting there, as if to scream at me, to tell me to look past what's right in front of me. I think there's something to there's people get into this thing about the debate between the efficacy and the validity of whether or not we should be using nature as a quote unquote argument for God. Again, I'm not going to go out and argue with the madman on his own terms. If a atheist can sit and see the glory of waves crashing against rocks and see nothing beyond that, then we are monkeys on a rock hurtling through a vacuum. That's all that says to them. I advise you, along with as a lover of the Chestertonian quips, to not enter into the padded cell with the madman and debate him about that. We could debate all day long about whether or not we are monkey. Of course, I don't believe that, but I think more efficaciously, going back to this question that my son asked me, why do I believe that Jesus is God? And I believe that Jesus is God because when I go out into the world, I don't find chaos. Now, a smart atheist might bring up entropy, and that would challenge some of this. But as Christians, we have the spiritual gift of hope. Unfortunately, many, if we're being honest, many in the world lack the theological gift of hope. And the theological gift of hope is a saving gift. So that's just something you have to recognize when you're talking with people about this, right? I'm not necessarily going to convince a person with these things that I'm expressing to you today. I would say that entropy is kind of a challenge and a problem to some of these things, but entropy, I don't know how, like, on the sidelines I want to get, if you actually were to consider entropy and the ramifications of entropy, because of it, there shouldn't be life. There should not be complex life. So that is a huge wrench in the argument of entropy, and the argument that we would just spontaneously emerge from the muck of the world, of the earth, when we live in an entropic universe. I don't think the entropic universe undermines, actually, in the end, what I'm saying here, because despite the entropic state that the universe seems to be moving in, we as Christians have a paradigm for that, right? Like, we unfortunately live in a fallen world. Entropy could be a random, the random chaos of entropy could be a result of the fall. It easily could fit within our worldview. At the same time, the order, the intelligibility is still present to us. And the fact that this so-called monkey on a rock hurtling through a vacuum, I'm able to go out and reach and touch this universe, to experience this universe. This universe is able to emanate something that is comprehensible to me, that I'm able to grasp. The Logos, I believe the Logos is the answer to why this is even possible. We would, of course, have to get into the reason why the Logos is that, the purpose of the Son in the circumcision of the eternal divine life, the Word. But there's a sense in which the Word is in a great orderer, right? Certainly the word is the logos, the word, the universe, the one word, the one verse is the reason why we have, as I told my son, we can go out, astronomers, all through history. All through history, astronomers were some of the most religious people you would meet in any culture. They didn't necessarily justify, though, why the night sky made them religious. I think it's because, going back to Bonaventure, God is self-evident to us. It's imprinted on us. Our minds are divinely illumined. And when, as an ancient astronomer, I'm going out night after night and I'm seeing the night sky and I'm starting to take notes and I'm writing down about this ordered night sky that I see, the reason for that, the reason I can justify that as being, is because of the Word, the great orderer of the universe. Let me see here, guys, what I have in comments. Looks like I have some random people. I don't know if some of you guys are new here or not. Looks like I see some names I don't recognize. Some good comments here. An innate sense to keep looking for what exactly? I think I answered that for you later. Let me see. I agree that the great mystery beyond the boundary of our empirical reach. Yeah. I think, look, this would get into my great interest around the Franciscan school as a intellectual tradition where Bonaventure discusses the ability of the human mind to abstract, right? Now, in the Thomistic reading of Aristotle and the process of abstraction, they don't really see, as far as I know, I'm not an expert in Thomas, but they don't really see a need to justify abstraction. Whereas Bonaventure saw a need to justify abstraction, which he uses as divine illumination, which was later, according to, and I am a protege, I would consider myself an amateur protege of Father Peter Fellner. According to Father Fellner, it was later expounded upon and sort of given precision through Scotus and Univocity. The intuition of Scotus, right? The thing that's made present to us before we even begin the process of abstraction. I would say it's even so. I am presupposing the ability of abstraction, of reaching empirical data. Like, empirical data is sort of downstream of divine illumination and intuition, as you would find in these scholastics. Now, would that convince a Humean skeptic? No, probably not. Hume, if you buy into Hume, who sought to undermine causality, who sought to really, with the later tradition of skepticism, as it were, sort of create epistemic solipsism, I think at a certain point, at that point, you end up with, inside of Chesterton's padded cell, arguing with someone that's in an insane asylum. So let's see. Hopefully, I probably butchered your question there, but hopefully, I think I answered it somewhat in the presentation later. You may have caught it. I don't remember what I was saying when this came up, Father. Depends on what you mean by nature, though. Everything in nature, in the sense that it's being used as a proof for God, right? I'm trying to think back what I would have been saying. Maybe if you could remind me where that was in reference to, Father. That was a few minutes ago. Yeah, okay. when we get into the great debate of nature versus supernature, and I don't know. Oh yeah. Okay, I see what you're saying. No, my mind went somewhere totally else. I was about to go into the nature supernature debate, which is highly contested among Dominicans and Franciscans. And I want to say, Father, as a Jesuit, you were probably a little bit more formed and probably maybe a little bit more sympathetic to the Thomistic reading of the nature supernature debate. Though I would say I think, and I don't know how prominent this is in the seminaries today, where in modern seminaries in the last 20, 30, 40 years, of the what David Bentley Hart refers to as the two-tier Thomism. Bonaventure tends to think of these things in the hierarchical sense, nature, supernature, and mainly as like modes of existence. That's a totally different thing. But you said you were talking about like going out into nature. But yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at. That everything in nature, in the sense that it's used as proof for God, because there's the argument that some will make that creationists, as a derogatory term, will use when we say that, oh, this thing in nature points towards God. Well, then they bring up the whole God of the gaps theory that we're arguing from. There's lacunas in our knowledge, and because of that, we place God in there, where the secular atheists, via the scientific revolution, would say, well, we just haven't been able to answer that yet because science hasn't got to that point where it's able to answer it. But you wait long enough, and we're able to answer why it's not Thor like casting down lightning bolts, and that is the friction between clouds and these kinds of things. Yeah, so that's kind of what I was getting at. But I think that the on a different kind of plane, on that, again, that more Chestertonian kind of plane of uh, stepping out of the padded cell of this rationalist box that these people have placed themselves in, and going out really with a little bit more of an inquisitive kind of childlike mind. None of these things, none of what we see in nature proves God. It just, as Bonaventure calls it, synderesis, that nature points towards and propels or compels us, whether we realize it or not, towards seeking God and finding the higher truths. And even like the Franciscans say that theology, where philosophy ends, theology picks up. And philosophy can take us quite far. I don't think that Bonaventure or Scotus or any of these guys, despite the accusations at times that they were, especially Bonaventure, he gets accused of this. The Seraphic Doctor often gets accused of being too inclined towards fideism, right? To suppressing our ability to rely on our natural senses. That's not true at all. They believe that philosophy actually takes you quite far. Philosophy, in fact, takes you to the very the terminus of philosophy is that God exists. The stepping beyond God exists is when you enter into the Trinitarian realm of God, which in the Franciscan tradition, we would say is where you step into theology proper, especially as it's revealed to us. Yes, definitely something to that effect. I've had to, since I've always had a great, and I think I've covered it on this channel quite a bit. I've always had a great love of nature, and I've always seen nature as this impetus for our connection with God. And I've struggled as a lover of the scholastic tradition, making sense of the nature supernature distinction, because I think it's very easy to end up in a sort of Hartian panentheism, where you pretty much immanentize the Trinity and kind of collapse everything into God. And that's certainly not the case of how I think that we should be approaching nature. I think that our relationship with nature should be such that, as Bonaventure says, I think it's it's like the way that I try to wrap my mind around it, that God, the Logos is the center and the circumference. It's the beginning of the end. It's the ever eternal and the ever present. So in a sense, when I go and I reach out and I touch a flower and I admire the flower, yeah, in a sense, I am experiencing God. But I don't think it's not necessarily I am experiencing God as such. You don't, when you pick the flower, you don't experience the beatific vision, but you do experience the what I'm kind of getting at in this lecture is the compelling of the heart, that restless heart to keep going. And I had just finished. I'm going to be releasing them on this channel in the next few weeks. A series on that I've put it out on my Patreon, but it's on Bonaventure's The Mind's Journey Through God, and on the seventh chapter, the seventh day, if you will, the seventh wing of the seraphim, as Bonaventure likens it to, he speaks of this day of rest where we stop searching. But there is a natural process that we go through, and it's hierarchical in Bonaventure's sense. So you're going from the lowest elements of nature hierarchically up, and then when you cross over into the order of grace, right, then you really start going up all the way until you reach the seventh wing, the seventh day, the day of rest, where we stop searching. So this might be a little bit of a convoluted lecture. I'm not sure. Hopefully it was helpful to some of you. Again, it was inspired by my attempt to explain to my son why I believe that Jesus is God. And it really, in my mind, there's many good reasons, but in my mind, the clearest reason for me is directly related to the intelligibility of the universe as only being explained by the Logos. And the Logos only makes sense within a Trinitarian context. And it's only accessible to us in that Trinitarian sense. It's accessible to us on an intuitive level, yes, via divine illumination. Even the unbaptized, even the unsaved have access to it. But on a Trinitarian level, on a participatory level, where we truly enter into the circumancessory life of the Trinity, that is only accessible through the order of grace, which would lead me down a completely different rabbit hole. But I'm kind of running out of time here. I hope you guys enjoyed this. It's a little bit different for what I usually cover on this channel, but I was, again, out of the mouth of babes, inspired by my son to cover this topic. And maybe it'll be useful to some of you all as you are out there engaging the world. I'm not saying don't abandon Aquinas's 5 proofs for the existence of God. If it speaks to you and if it means something to you, great. Don't necessarily think it's going to be a convincing argument for other people, but I don't think that's necessarily necessary either. Again, sometimes we can have within our own worldview conversations among ourselves. This personally, for me, if I were to sit down and have a serious conversation with someone, why do I believe in God? And specifically, why do I believe that Jesus is God? I think that this is what sort of led me intellectually down the path towards Christ and his church. So God bless you all. Amen. Prayer don't forget to be praying for our new Pope Leo the 14th. Fantastic name. He seems like a fantastic man. He has just been bequeathed the weight of 2,000 years of history upon his shoulders, and that's a heavy weight. And I'm sure you guys are praying for the Pope, but don't forget to pray for the Pope. God bless you all. Amen.